Okay, we'll kick off. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to meet everyone virtually this morning for today's session, which is enterprise risk management to balance risk and reward. We intend really to talk today about risk management in the round and how it might add value to your business, and really share our experiences of what we see going on with our clients today of all shapes and sizes. Maybe we just move on and I'll just introduce myself briefly before we get into the webinar proper. So my name is Sarah McAllister. I'm partner in charge of business risk services here for Grant Thornton in Ireland. I'm sad to say I'm 25 years in this business from the point of view of helping clients with risk, whether that be in professional practice or that be in industry. I have operated in both. So I have lived the story as well as advised on the story, I suppose it's fair to say. And we advise clients in all sectors outside of financial services on how to manage the risks of their business day to day, how to optimize opportunities, how to deal with change and transformation, and really deliver on their strategy and their operational ambitions. And most of our clients would range from small SME businesses right up to PLC listed businesses at all stages of their journey across technology, the corporate sector and the public sector. Really, that's what represents our client base at the moment. So moving on, we thought it would be useful to start with really the fundamentals of risk management, what it is, why we do it, why it's necessary, and how to approach it. And really, over the course of time, risk management has really moved and really shifted from being something, I suppose, that was seen in the industry as something quite tactical and maybe quite separate to strategy, which is really not the right way to look at it at all, but fundamentally has shifted from being something quite narrow and something quite siloed into something that much more holistic, and which we'll touch on shortly. And fundamentally, an organization can't really achieve its ambitions, whether they be strategic and or operational or transformational, without managing risk day to day and without optimizing opportunities. And a lot of organizations maybe do that without really realizing it, but at the same time don't have the structures maybe to enable it or to help them on their journey. And a part of our job in Grant Thornton is to help our clients in being able to put the rules of the game in place that they can better manage those dimensions for themselves day to day. And it doesn't have to be in industry. It can be very straightforward and right-sized to the client's stage of growth and or where they're headed. And I suppose from the point of view of the cost benefit of it, what they're willing to spend and how they want to approach it. So moving on, we thought it would be useful just to give people an overview of enterprise risk management and what it means. So from the point of view of something being quite tactical, maybe historically, and being phrased as risk management purist, from a best practice point of view in today's market, we talk about enterprise risk management, which, as I mentioned earlier, is something much more holistic and really caters for risk as it runs across an organization, as opposed to one particular type. And really, enterprise risk management enables an organization to be able to see holistically what's going on and how one part of the business and how it might be impacted by a particular set of circumstances might have a knock-on effect on other parts of the business. And I think it's fair to say, as we stand here today and we advise our clients, that I don't think I ever remember a time where risk was so pertinent and so in front of people day to day in their lives. And the plethora of things that a lot of our clients are trying to deal with. And what I mean by that, if you think about it, we've got supply chain issues for many of our clients in the manufacturing sector. We've got labor shortages, which are prevalent in all sectors at the moment. I think it's fair to say post-COVID. We've got the energy crisis and what that might bring for a lot of our clients and a lot of the contingency planning that they're trying to do around that. Most businesses, whether they be in the technology sector, whether they be in the public sector, whether they be in the FMGC sector, are also dealing with quite an extent of change and transformation as they move their businesses forward and they kind of set themselves up for success post-COVID. And really that varies based on what their objectives are and what they're trying to achieve. But it's fair to say that every organization of every scale and size is dealing with change and transformation of some sort, whether that be people change or whether that be technology change or whether that be fundamentally how they deliver their services. And on top of that, you're dealing with quite a lot of focus and attention, justifiable focus and attention on things like cybersecurity and technology risk. and also cash flow management and some of the pressures people are feeling around all of that. So I think it's fair to say that risk management is very much front and center at the moment. And for that reason, from the point of view of what the key success factors are to that, we thought we might touch on a few of those today. So realistically, any organization would need to put in place a risk policy of some sort. It doesn't have to be 100 pages long. It can be 5 pages long. It can be 10 pages long. But once it says what it needs to say and does what it needs to do, it sets the ground rules for how the organization wants to approach risk. An organization needs to understand its risk appetite. I think a lot of our clients struggle with this. They may approach trying to do a risk register, for instance, which is one of the key tools to a risk management program, but fundamentally, they haven't really set the rules of the game, and they tend to then kind of move around it and not really know what they're trying to pin it against. So we might talk a little bit about risk appetite later on. Risk assessment, which is in essence the process that all of our clients work through to arrive at what is a robust risk register, which they use to help them manage the risks of the organization. And a little bit around risk reporting and risk training. And I suppose ultimately the rewards that comes from managing risk in an optimum fashion. And what I mean by that is that it is inherently linked to the strategy of the business. It needs to be inherently linked to the strategy of the business. And we don't want to forget the fact that opportunities are also things that need to be managed from a risk perspective. It's not all downside. It's not all about the hazards that the business might face. It's also very important to optimize the opportunities that the organization could exploit. And that should form part of a risk management program too. So moving on, just here, I think is just a summary, I suppose, of what we've touched on really lightly there in the last 2 slides as to what risk management was and what risk management has become. I think it's fair to say that from the point of view of even the financial crisis, which is now 12, 13, 14 years ago, a lot of what was pointed at the time as being the cause and effect of that centered around the fact that risk management had remained quite siloed and quite narrow in its coverage. And really, realistically, that meant that there was a lot of interdependencies in risks that happened in organizations that weren't caught and weren't considered maybe appropriately and sufficiently in their risk management programs. Today, risk management is seen in a much broader way, and the ownership of risk management is seen in a much broader way. And that's for all organizations. We would deal with construction companies, with manufacturing companies, with public service companies, and fundamentally the basics are the same for all of them as to how they actually should try and achieve success through their risk management programs. So really outlined there is just some of the distinct differences. Silo-based, a lot of risks that weren't owned or people weren't accountable for the management of them, versus something that is much more open and deals with interrelationships and follows the train of thought through the organization when it comes to risk management, and a clear sense of how good or bad things are on a day-to-day basis, that a board of directors and or a management team can embrace that and help them make better decisions in real time. Moving on. There's a few things here. I know there's a lot of detail here, so I won't focus on all this detail. I think it's a good takeaway to have. But fundamentally, there's huge features to an enterprise risk management program that I feel would resonate with most people today. A lot of people have looked at this subject or heard of this phraseology over the course of time, but maybe just to touch on a few that might be of value. The primary tool that's used in any risk management program, as I've mentioned there earlier, is a risk register. And a lot of organizations will have one, and in all shapes and sizes, and fundamentally of all shapes and sizes of quality, I suppose. We would meet clients on an ongoing basis that think they have things as it needs to be, and then realize that they need a bit of help and a bit of support to get it to tell them what it should tell them from the point of view of their risk reporting to their audit committee or to their board, or even just to help the management team in making decisions around even investment and projects and what to focus on. So risk register is a really core element of an enterprise risk management program. Fundamentally, I think the other distinct thing to focus on is that risk tends to run on a horizontal and vertical basis. And what I mean by that, if you think about it, you have certain risks, let's say in a finance area, in a finance function, that would run top to bottom and that are unique to finance and maybe don't touch any other part of the organization. Whereas then you have a risk like business continuity management or business continuity risk that runs across an organization and pretty much covers and touches every part of the organization, whether that be operations or whether that be finance or whether that be services or anything else, you know. And fundamentally then there has to be a consideration for both the horizontal and the vertical. However, controls, when it comes to the controls that are managing those risks, they tend to run vertically, and the ownership of them tends to run vertically. So if you can imagine, you know, in a finance team or in a HR team or in an operations team, the head of those functions or the head of those departments would tend to allocate ownership for controls on a vertical basis. So, you know, this is where the mismatch can arise, where you've got things running across the business and then you've got people owning elements of them and elements of the controls, but no one owns it end to end. So we help a lot of our clients with being able to get a better sense of getting their arms around that and having a fuller view of what's going on in their businesses day to day. I think realistically, the other really important factor is that a board and an audit committee can't really achieve real-time view of risk and can't really get a sense of exactly, you know, the state of affairs without having, you know, proper tools in place. And that being, you know, your risk policy, your risk register, and rules of the game around the risk appetite and what the organization is willing to take risks on and are not willing to take risks on, the cost benefit of those, how far it's willing to go, how far it's willing to invest. And once those things are batted down, it makes the job of the board and an audit committee much easier in every day. So moving on from there, we might just touch on a few of the benefits, which are many. We're just highlighting here elements of governance, people and business management benefits that we felt would resonate with the audience today. And really, the most important thing, and again, I'm sure lots of people on the call today would know that risk management has to run from the top down, has to run from the executive down. I think that's very clear to most people. Not always the case in some organizations, and a lot of people in middle management would battle at times to try and get that to sit right. But fundamentally, if it drives from the top down, it's going to be a much easier thing to embrace and to leverage across the organization. I think enterprise risk management would fundamentally facilitate much better communication, does facilitate much better communication across the board and senior management. And it does give people a greater sense of comfort around how well controlled the business is, how resilient it is. And I think that's a word that's very prevalent every time we turn on the news at the moment. The word resilience comes through, but really how resilient businesses are. I also feel, and we feel as a team in GT, that a lot of boards and audit committees are referencing the fact that they've managed to survive COVID and therefore everything's fine. I don't feel, and we don't feel, and a lot of our non-executives that sit on boards would be of the view that that's actually not the case. And really it doesn't get away from the fact that risk management as a whole is something that needs to be reconsidered by boards and needs to be reconsidered by audit committees, predominantly even since COVID. And maybe there's been a realization by a lot of these organizations that in fact they hadn't got it right, or they hadn't pitched it right, or it needs to be rethought in terms of moving forward and enabling their businesses. So I think that piece around assurance and confidence in the business itself and how it's managing its environment is very, very important in today's universe in terms of what all of our clients are facing. As I mentioned earlier, you know, it enables faster and better strategic decision making for sure. It really does. It means that people feel like they have all the facts in front of them before they make a decision around resources or investment or projects for that matter. And really, I suppose it just embraces that sense of the culture of the business and people thinking before they act and being able to take decisions that they're very aware of the risks that might be in front of them as a consequence. Outside of that, you know, maybe just to touch a little bit on the fact that it also enables much more accurate pricing of contracts and services, because the organization itself has a much better view of the risks that it's managing and how it might need to, I suppose, really kind of balance that load in terms of what it charges for its services to its customers, whether that be products that are going out the door or whether that be actual service delivery or a public service that is being delivered on behalf of the public at large. It still should take into consideration the risks the business is trying to manage and how that impacts them in terms of cost day to day. Moving on. Again, I suppose this is just to reaffirm the critical success factors. And I might focus on this for a few minutes because I think this is really important in terms of pragmatism here. We're not for a minute suggesting that an enterprise risk management program is a one size fits all for every client at every stage of their journey. That's the last thing it should be. And I think fundamentally, one of the things that's very important is that a client doesn't feel like they're trying to be fitted into a box that kind of suits everybody else, but doesn't suit them. It's very clear that for it to be successful, risk management needs to be right-sized. It needs to be fit for purpose. It needs to reflect the culture of the organization, where it's come from, where it's going. It needs to take on board, I suppose, the feelings of the board and the audit committee and management as to how they want to operate and what they are willing to put at risk and what they're not. Different organizations are going to have a different appetite around risk. I think it's fair to say that every organization has to take risks. Otherwise, it's not going to achieve its strategy. You can't lay out plans for yourself as a business unless you're going to take an element of risk in order to achieve them. But what this is about is getting the balance right and calibrating it in such a way that actually you're enabling your strategy and you're enabling the delivery of your ambitions and not hampering them. I think a lot of our clients in the initial stages of trying to grapple with these concepts find that there's been quite a detachment between their risk management program and their strategy and their ambitions, and they've kind of operated in two separate worlds. And what's very important is that they actually link and that one thing enables the other. If you can imagine, someone might set 10 objectives for themselves to achieve over a 5-year period, but fundamentally, if they're not reflected in how they manage the risks within their business and within their entities day to day, then they've very little chance of getting there. So that's very important, that it is right-sized and that it's fit for purpose. And that it's pragmatic and that people can use it and they're not frightened by it. It's in plain English. It's very, sensible in terms of the risk register and putting it together and risk assessments and how they're done. It should be very easy for people to relate to, and it should be in plain English. And fundamentally, there should be clear accountability for who owns what, why, and when. And what I mean by that is, in designing kind of what is the risk universe and deciding how it's controlled, it has to be very clear in the organization from top to bottom who owns what risks and why they own them, and fundamentally where they have delegated responsibility to different people, maybe within their team, to control certain elements of those risks and have controls in place to manage them, so that the board and in turn management are comfortable that they've got their arms around all of what they need to. So again, reaffirming kind of the very critical success factors of a risk management program, I think makes it really something that people can resonate with and can realize that it's actually very doable no matter where people are in their journey. Moving on. Sorry, can you move on there, Valerie? So this slide really caters for, I suppose, what is a risk? Sorry, can you go back one there, Valerie? What is risk and what is risk management? Little bit textbook, I suppose, but fundamentally, a risk refers to one or more potential events that may affect the achievement objectives. So that really speaks to what I mentioned earlier around the fact that it needs to relate to the strategy of a business or an organization and or its key operational objectives. And that may be something that affects people or processes or technology or all three. And fundamentally, it's anything that could potentially go wrong that could impact the achievement of the ambitions of the organization. Whereas risk management itself is defined as a process that is really affected by a board of directors and management, and relates obviously to the strategy setting process of an enterprise to identify those potential events and then to manage them within the risk appetite of the organization. So if you can imagine, a software as a solution business, for example, in a technology sector might have a very different risk appetite in terms of product development and how it's, planning on, I suppose, leveraging its product base at pace in order to achieve venture capital funding and move the dial forward and have its valuation level as fast as possible, as high as possible, as quickly as possible to monetize its product suite. Whereas a business that might be manufacturing, consumables could have a very different risk appetite and a much longer term view on how it's going to permeate its market and how it's going to expand its product portfolio, and kind of on a phased basis what it's going to do in a much more, I suppose, longer time frame, more right-sized time frame, in a completely different sector, completely different profile, completely different speed in terms of how the actual sector moves and shakes. And likewise, a lot of our clients in the public sector are in a position where they have to manage risks that they've no real choice about managing because they're providing a public service. And they don't necessarily get to pick and choose the risks that they'd like or they'd prefer to outsource to a degree, never losing the responsibility for them, obviously, but having some sort of shared responsibility, maybe with a third party for some certain risks, or even potentially, disengage from certain activities where they don't feel comfortable managing certain risks. In the public sector, that's not always possible. So, again, it's very important that all of those things are thought about in terms of how a risk management program is designed and deployed. Moving on from those definitions, I'd like to touch on just a few key concepts that are very important to the success of a risk management program. And they are risk capacity, risk appetite, and risk tolerance. And often, many people get confused between these terms and often interchange them, in fact, in terms of explaining their views and maybe even trying to settle on these concepts in terms of how they discuss them internally with their management teams and with their board. And it's very important as part of determining how you're going to manage your business as you move forward to understand the difference between these concepts. So risk capacity is the maximum amount of risk any organization could tolerate before it goes under, basically, and before it starts to really creak. And risk capacity, again, in different organizations is going to vary, but it's the absolute max that an organization could cope with before it goes very pear-shaped, let's say, for want of a better word. Whereas the risk appetite is the optimum amount of risk that the board and or the management team is willing to accept in order to deliver on its ambitions and its strategy. So it's definitely going to be lower than the capacity of an organization. And I suppose it's how it's calibrated and how far away that is something that collectively the board and management and an audit committee in turn, if it's in place, needs to consider and needs to agree on. Risk tolerance is that bit of variation that happens at the edges of where something starts to go wrong. Let's say there's a cyber event, or there's a data breach, or there's an issue around key man risk, and someone has left the organization, and there is that kind of range of uncomfortableness that happens around risk appetite that becomes known as risk tolerance. So if you can imagine, as an example, an organization might turn around and say, in terms of data protection and data breaches, that it has, a risk capacity to tolerate, and I know I'm just picking a number here to give you an example, but a risk capacity to tolerate maybe 10 data breaches in a year. I know that might sound obtuse, but let's say, for hypothetically, that an organization says, 10 data breaches a year, its risk appetite is actually 4. Its risk tolerance is up to 6. Once it goes beyond 6, it's a very uncomfortable territory, and it's something it doesn't want to be in. But fundamentally, having an understanding for the distinct differences of those concepts really helps a management team in structuring its risk management program and understanding, where good, bad, and indifferent, and how to react quickly enough to those types of dimensions. And again, a bit of verbiage and a bit of language here that sounds a bit textbooky, but again, putting that into plain English is really important. And it really resonates very well with our clients when they can do that. So moving on, this fundamentally is, what good enterprise risk management looks like, from risk governance all the way down to the risk management process itself. So I think it's fair to say that these would be the fundamental elements that we would support our clients with to varying degrees. So some of our clients would have certain elements of these things very well understood and batted down, and others would really struggle with trying to get all this to work together for them, and would need maybe at times a little bit of support to make this gel. But if I take it maybe from the top, I think it's fair to say that from an ERM perspective, having the right governance structure in place is really critical. And what that would relate to would be board committee and or potentially, depending on the size and scale of the organization, a risk committee that reports into a board committee that understands very clearly its mandate and its terms of reference, that takes ownership, I suppose, for the oversight of risk management within the organization. Then moving on from there, a very clearly defined risk appetite, which we've mentioned a couple of times in the session already, which deals with things like the capacity, how far they're willing to go in terms of tolerating risk, and then fundamentally what the appetite of the organization is and where their comfort zone is and where they feel they're happy to play. And then essentially moving then down into what would be the key risk management tools, which is the whole measurements, limits, thresholds, things that need to be set. Again, does not have to be rocket science. For the large majority of organizations, would really suggest that it should be very simple, very straightforward, kept to a minimum. Simple is good in my opinion and in our opinion. Does not need to be over engineered. But really, the rules of the game, I suppose, is what's necessary there. And fundamentally dropping down to what is that risk assessment process, where you work in the organization as a team to identify the risks, to assess, and prioritize them and rate and rank them, and then to monitor them and report on them back to your risk committee if it's there, and or your board, and how you go about that on a day-to-day, month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter basis. And again, depending on the complexity of the organization and or where they are in terms of their maturity around risk management, that process might only happen twice a year. It might happen quarterly if it's a larger business, and or it might happen once a year if the business is in a very static environment where a lot of risks don't fundamentally change that much. But it should be done, and it should be kept on top of, and it should be defendable in terms of the board's responsibilities and its governance responsibilities. It should fundamentally be something that lives and breathes in the organization. So moving on. Really, fundamentally, enterprise risk management can be thought about across these 4 pillars. And we would suggest that any organization can really allocate its risks into any one of these 4 boxes. And in the truest sense, I mean that from the point of view of, we could be talking about AIB Bank, or we could be talking about a manufacturing company, or we could be talking about a small technology startup, or we could be talking about a public services company. And we would have clients in all of those sectors. And really, at the end of the day, it is possible to categorize your risk universe into any one of these 4 boxes. It does not need to be 10 or 15 or 20 different categories of risk. It does not need to be overcomplicated. It should be fairly easy to allocate risks across these 4 pillars. So just maybe touching on the differences between them and what they relate to. So fundamentally, strategic is what it says in the tin. Strategic risks are those that relate to the strategy of the business and the execution of the strategy. And it's, I suppose, the environment in which the organization is operating, the competitive environment. So any risks to do with the strategy, potentially even maybe, sustainability strategy and or the articulation of strategy should fall within that category. In the context of regulatory and compliance, that would specifically relate to any regulations and or compliance requirements that the organization would have. And they obviously differ for every type of organization. Some are common to all. So things like GDPR, for instance, would be common to pretty much all organizations. Data protection is something that everyone has to deal with in today's world. But there's also unique regulatory dimensions that would apply to each type of organization. And they may center around things like health and safety or specific accreditations that the organization may have from the point of view of its workforce, ISO accreditations, or even fundamentally things around non-conformance with certain regulations that are prescribed and unique to that sector. So anything to do with regulatory and or compliance, health and safety, HR, GDPR, even anti-money laundering and some of our clients would all fall into that world. Financial risks is again pretty straightforward. So anything with that financial connotation to it would fall into that category. And that would be things like liquidity risk and funding risk, treasury risk, all of those elements of risk that affect the capital of the business and or the sustainability of the business can be classified under the banner of financial. And lastly, operational, which is very much the largest category of risk. It basically reflects all other things. So the very definition of operational risk is that includes all people, processes, and technology that are used in the delivery of day-to-day activities. So if you can imagine, if we talk about big ticket items that most organizations are grappling with now, you would have supply chain risk in there, you would have people risk in there from the point of view of labor shortages, you would have anything to do with the challenges that organizations are facing in terms of business continuity risk or key man risk, cyber risk, change and transformation, anything to do with very substantial project risks that the organization may be carrying. But basically anything that it would manifest or derive out of the day-to-day services and operations that the business delivers on or provides to its clients or its customers or the public at large would fall in there. So fundamentally, if you can think about it, in doing a risk assessment and trying to follow that thread through the organization and completing what is known in the industry as a risk register, your risk register should look like it has four categories of risk, and it should reflect pretty typically the strategic, operational, regulatory, and financial risks that the organization has. And forcing that discipline actually helps to simplify the process and helps to simplify a risk management program, rather than end up with a laundry list of 20 different types of risks that people can't get their head around and are struggling to figure out what they mean. So we would always suggest that people can adopt that approach in pretty much every business today. Moving on. So it's very important, I think, to focus on both the downside and the upside. I mentioned earlier the fact that, you know, this is not all about the bad stuff. It's also about the good stuff. It's very important that board and management teams consider both the hazards that they might face, but that they don't let that cripple them in terms of actually running the business. They can't obsess about every single thing to the nth degree, but they do have to be able to show and transparently be able to defend the facts that they've got their arms around the things that could damage the organization from the point of view of its strategy, its operations, and its reputation. But there's also that piece around opportunity and or, you know, change and transformation. That this is about optimizing opportunities and not losing sight of them and not reacting to them quick enough is also a risk to a business, and or being able to manage change and transformation optimally and get it delivered on time, on budget, is also something that has to be managed from a risk management perspective and optimized. So a risk management program isn't all about the bad stuff and shouldn't be considered to be a cost. It should very much be considered to be an investment in the future of the business and something that actually is seen, you know, to add value and to enable a business, but not just a cost and a burden to a business. So very important here that, you know, we felt that we could reflect not just the downside, but also the upside, you know, the ability to seize opportunities, the ability to identify, you know, positive things in real time and be able to actually capitalize on them and potentially leverage a business faster and move it forward faster, because you know, the risk management program gave management the transparency to be able to see these things clearly and distinctly and be much better informed around how they might react to them. It is also about, you know, the downside, obviously, because you would find without it and without it being attached to the strategy of a business, there can be a lot of inefficiency. You know, there can be that piece around potential financial loss and or fraud occurring, you know, because people maybe missed a ball on how certain things might manifest within the organization. And then obviously, you know, there's the consequential reputational damage and or reduced confidence, whether that's from a board or whether that's from shareholders or whether that's from a broader stakeholder group. But I want to be clear that this is not all about the, you know, the bad stuff. It is also very much about the good stuff. And any client we know that has kind of gone on this journey and has managed to implement something that is right sized to them has got great benefit out of how it helps them embrace opportunities and exploit opportunities. So we felt it was very important maybe to reference that. Moving on. So really this is just, I'll only touch on this for a minute, but really this is just, an articulation of what's on the face of a risk register. I'm sure most people on this call today will have seen risk registers of different shapes and forms over the course of time. But realistically, a risk register outlines very clearly for a board and for a management team, the risks, the risk descriptions, the people who own them, the controls that are in place that mitigate against them. Very important that those controls are in fact the controls that mitigate the risks in question and don't have, no relationship to them or may not have any bearing on them. Really important that they are connected and do have some sort of relationship. And then fundamentally, there's a rating and ranking that happens. Again, I'm not going to focus on that too much today, around how good, bad, or indifferent the environment is from a risk perspective. So you will have a rating that happens on a gross basis, on a net basis, on a risk register that basically says, this is the risk if it manifested, this would be the consequence for us if we had no controls, and this would be the consequence for us if we had control, if we have our controls and they're working. And that gives, the organization a much better feel for what its exposures are and what it has its arms around and what it has to do more about. And then in turn, I suppose the actions that it needs to take its risk exposures down to something that's within its appetite, that it's decided its appetite is. So you would be surprised, a lot of clients actually, when they've come through this exercise, they're quite shocked by the amount of risks that are outside their appetite or their comfort and the uncomfortableness they feel about that. But because it's on a page in front of them, they suddenly realize, oh, we need to do something with that one, and that one, because that's not where we thought we were. So a really useful exercise from that perspective. And moving on, we just thought it would be useful to share with you today just a kind of a visual, I suppose, of what would be an extract of a risk register. Again, not going to go through it in too much detail because I know it's not the most exciting subject in the world for a lot of people, but it's still very essential and fundamental to any business that it's done well. And that really takes people across the risk register from left to right, taking it from the risk to the risk category, describing what the risk is, very important that it's clear and distinct, and then rating and ranking it across its impact and probability, and then articulating very clearly the controls that manage against those risks and the actions that need to be taken to basically take it back within appetite and bring it back down into a comfort level. So again, we thought it would be useful as a takeaway to share that. Moving on from there, just a really light touch just to finish up around risk reporting. Again, huge benefit here in terms of boards, risk committees, audit committees, senior management being able to put their hands on something that tells them transparently what's going on in terms of their organization. So again, something that can be done on a page, on a dashboard, 5 or 6 metrics that say, these are our key risks. These are our top 10 risks. These are the risks that we can see coming at us in terms of our sector or our industry. This is where we feel we're controlled and where we're not. These are our actions that we've agreed to take and where they are. Are they on track? Are they not on track? And also a bit of detail around maybe risk events that have occurred within the business over the course of the year or the quarter or the month since the last meeting that might have been had. We've had a data breach and we did this and it's been addressed and the root cause is being determined and it's been remedied. And being able to provide a holistic review of the current state, the go forward state, and how things that have gone wrong have been properly catered for and closed down, and the risk of them, excuse the pun, recurring has been very much addressed. So really important because it gives boards much more confidence in how the organization is being run and in terms of how management is supported in its ambitions and how it's going to deliver on its ambitions. And again, if there's issues that they can be highlighted and, further investment and or support can be given to tackle them, that they're not just brushed to the side, forgotten about, or not even visible maybe in certain instances to certain people. Moving on. So really, I suppose from the point of view of what we wanted to share today and what I wanted to talk about today, it's just a flavor factor. Risk, how it's moved over the course of time, the fact that it's very prevalent at the moment in a lot of boards' minds and a lot of stakeholders' minds post-COVID, as to how they're going to approach this moving forward to enable their businesses, to help their businesses move forward in a really smart, structured, efficient way that gives them the best chance to deliver on their strategy and their operational agenda. I don't, envy anyone at the moment trying to deal with what's going on in the world at large and even locally and domestically in terms of risk. But we're doing our very best as an organization to support our clients in that regard. And anything we could do to offer up advice to yourselves today, or any of our clients for that matter, as we move forward, we'd seek to do. Hope you've enjoyed the content. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know.
Thanks, Sarah. I don't think we have any questions in, so thanks for
problem.
that, and thanks everyone for calling in.
All right, take care. Thank you.
Bye.